Thank you, Katrina, and thanks to everybody coming out on a cold night to hear about Bungaree. I'd like to make an acknowledgement also of the original Indigenous clans of the Mossman area. The Goroalgal at George's Head and Middle Head, the Borragiggle at Bradley's Head, the Birrabirragal at Clontarf and the Spit, and the Cameragal of the North Shore, whose heartland was Manly Cove. As Katrina said, I started researching Bungaree's life in 1987 when I wrote about the different responses to English colonisation of Bennelong, Pemulwuy and Bungaree in Sydney City, which was a historical guidebook I self-published in 1988. And I found Bungaree was flamboyant, intelligent, shrewd, an explorer, a great voyager, a go-between, an esteemed elder of his people, a beggar and a drunkard, all those things. Bungaree was a talented communicator and a clever mimic when language failed. He reached out across the cultural gulf to become a valued friend of Matthew Flinders, Governor Lachlan Macquarie, and many explorers, writers and botanists and artists, as we will see. In his later life, Bungaree adopted the role of a comic character with elaborate manners, begging in the streets of Sydney, wearing cast-off naval and military uniforms and a stiff cocked hat. He imitated the walk, gestures and expressions of former governors. And from his vantage point at George's Head, Bungaree was rowed out by two of his wives to greet the captains of visiting ships and drank their health, preferably in old French brandy, or, failing that, in rum, gin, or the least was Cooper's beer. As with the ancient Greeks, it was an Aboriginal custom for the leading man in a place to greet foreigners, and visitors customarily gave presents. I was immediately fascinated by the personality of Bungaree and the unexpectedly wide dimensions and importance of this one life, which involved cross-cultural relationships between Indigenous people and Europeans when such a relationship was rare in early Sydney. Bungaree was a diplomat who created a link between these two otherwise opposite worlds. And after writing King Bungaree, published by David Rosenberg at Kangaroo Press in 1992, I was encouraged by Dr. Fred McCarthy, the anthropologist from the Australian Museum, to further study history and anthropology, and I started at Macquarie University at the age of 53, becoming a very mature age student indeed. So it was Bungaree who got me into Aboriginal history. It was a long haul, and I eventually got my PhD only in 2008. I'll read the note, I can't work out what it says. Oh yes, my entry on Bungaree went on the Dictionary of Sydney website this week and contains much of his story. So, that's the muster, the ship's muster kept by the mate and others on board ships. And it says Nanbarry, Wingle, Bungaree, Port Jackson for a passage to Norfolk Island, 29th of May 1798. Discharged in Sydney, 27th of July. This entry in the muster of HMS Reliance records the first known mention and the first voyage of the famous Broken Bay seafarer to the remote island colony of Norfolk Island in the Pacific Ocean, 1,000 nautical miles north-east of Sydney. His shipmates were Nanbarry, nephew of the Cadigal leader Gallaby, the white-chested sea eagle Gallaby, and Wingle, who at various times said he came from Broken Bay and in his later life was at Port Stephens. Because of adverse winds, the round trip took 60 days. Usually it was only 10 days for each leg, and that explains how the young English naval lieutenant Matthew Flinders met and came to respect Bungaree. In 1795, Flinders and Surgeon George Bass, also on board, had sailed from England on Reliance with Bennelong, and Bennelong gave them a vocabulary which actually helped save their lives down in the south coast later on when they could talk to Broken Bay men. We'll see for his ships because it's the only way to represent Bungaree in the period before we have any portraits. So that's the sloop Norfolk replica, which was built in 1998 and it's moored in the Tamar River in Georgetown, Tasmania. In 1799, Flinders, then aged 25, took Bungaree with him on a coastal survey aboard the tiny 25-tonne capacity decked longboat, Norfolk, built on Norfolk Island, from Norfolk Pine. And they went to Brobby Island, Fraser Island and Harvey Bay. Flinders relied on Bungaree's knowledge of Aboriginal protocol and skill as a go-between with coastal Aborigines during that 6 weeks voyage. 15 years later, in Terra Australis, Flinders wrote that Bungaree's good disposition and open and manly conduct had attracted my esteem. Bungaree, wrote Flinders, also on the voyage, formed an intimate acquaintance with his black and white cat Trim, born at sea on Reliance in 1797. When Trim was hungry, he went below, straight to Bungaree's kit bag, as Flinders writes it, but kit bag today, where there was generally a remnant of black swan. The Norfolk began to leak and returned to Sydney. That voyage, this was the big one. 1802-3, Bungaree became the first Australian-born person to circumnavigate our continent. When he sailed with Matthew Flinders in the sloop HMS Investigator, which left Port Jackson on 22nd of July 1802, accompanied by Lady Nelson. On board Lady Nelson was Nan Barrier, who's often wrongly said to have circumnavigated. He returned from Cumberland Island and the Great Barrier Reef and didn't circumnavigate with Bungaree. They sailed north through the Great Barrier Reef, surveyed the Gulf of Carpentaria, they visited Kupang in Timor, and they returned by the west coast, returning to Sydney in June 1803. So on this 11-month voyage, Bungaree often used his knowledge of Aboriginal protocol to negotiate peaceful meetings with local Indigenous people. This is one of the strange maps of Bungaree's farm at George's Head, because it doesn't show the George's Head at all, it shows the Middle Head. And there are 2 or 3 variations of that. We know that in 1815, in January, Governor Lachlan Macquarie reserved the land and he erected huts at George's Head for Bungaree and his clan to settle and cultivate. They were given a fishing boat, clothing, seeds and farming implements. And that occasion, Macquarie presented Bungaree with his metal gorget or breastplate, which proclaimed him Bungaree, Chief of the Broken Bay Tribe, 1815. And that is misrepresented in much later reports where he's called King of the Blacks, King of Sydney, and other spurious names. That's the name and the title that Macquarie gave Bungaree, and it's shown clearly by Mikhailov, the Russian artist, in 1820, just 5 years later. Elizabeth Macquarie also gave Bungaree a sow and pigs, a pair of Muscovy ducks, and outfits for his wife Matora and their daughter. The Cutter Mermaid, another voyage, 1817, when Bungaree again went to sea, and this time with Captain Philip Parker King, the son of Governor Philip Gidley King, who had orders to survey the north and west coasts of Australia. King, later Australia's first born admiral, wrote, "He was about 45 years of age, of a sharp, intelligent and unassuming disposition, and promised to be of much service to us in our intercourse with the natives." The snub-nosed Cutter Mermaid left Port Jackson in December 1817, put into Twofold Bay, steered for Bass Strait and followed the Great Australian Bight to King George Sound in Albany. And Bungaree assisted the botanist Alan Cunningham, who, collecting plants, who actually called him then our worthy native chief, but also praised the character of this enterprising Australian. And he's one of the first people, therefore, to be called an Australian, a very early use of the name. It's interesting that in later vocabularies in King George Sound, which is now Albany, you get 2 words from the Sydney language. One's cooey, and the other is the word for walking, which slips my mind. But there they are. People puzzled about how those words were the same in Western Australia as they were in Sydney. Well, Bungaree was there, and he was followed by other Aboriginals. Aboriginal sailors. King named Mullet Bay on North Goulburn Island in consequence of the enormous shoals of that fish which were seen near the shores, and which Bungaree speared several of his fish gigs. Gavin Suter, Mossman's eminent historian, recently pointed out to me that there is a place called Bungaree Island near the Tiwi Islands, but neither of us has been able to find out who named it and when they named it, unfortunately, as yet. There's also a village called Bungaree up on Bribie Island, and there were ships named after him in the past. So, that's the distinguished painting by the distinguished academic and artist from Russia in April 1820, fresh from their perilous voyage in the Antarctic seas. His Russian Imperial Majesty's exploring ship Vostok, which means east, and Mirny, which means peaceful, commanded by Captain Fabian Bellingshausen, soon met Bungaree, who came on board with his wife Matora and a son and daughter. The classically trained Russian artist Pavel Nikolaevich Mikhailov sketched this image of Bungaree. He wears his bark headband, usually an indication of initiated man. It shows his wavy hair, in the words of the Russian astronomer Ivan Semenov, curled in rings a la typhus. And Bungaree wears no European clothing, but around his neck hangs the precious gorget given to him 5 years before by Macquarie, and you'll see a very small nose peg, probably a bird bone, thrust through his nose. I believe this head and shoulders watercolour is the first portrait of so many made of Bungaree, and I'll say why later on. Bungaree's statement to Bellingshausen, "These are my people, this is my shore," pointing to the north shore of Port Jackson, Sydney Harbour, can be seen as a land claim over the north shore of Port Jackson, which he and his people who came from Broken Bay slowly absorbed the previous clans, which had been, a lot of them, wiped out by smallpox. Colby's clan, for example, leaving 3 people out of what might have been 60 men, women and children in 1788. Bungaree and Matora, his first wife. Mikhailov made portraits of family members, and these are now in the State Russian Museum in St. Petersburg. A few were lithographed by Ivan Pavlovich Friedrich and published in St. Petersburg in the Atlas to Bellingshausen's voyage in 1831. Bungaree had twice been to the Hunter River settlement. Something new that I found out in this process, that almost everywhere a new settlement, a new colony was made, an Aboriginal person joined them. Salamander in Hobart, who was a son-in-law of Bungaree. And Bungaree himself in 1801 and 1804 went to the Hunter River, which became Newcastle. I think that's where he met his first wife Matora about that time. According to the linguist Reverend Lancelot Threlkeld, Matawa means small snapper specifically in the Newcastle Lake Macquarie language called a Wawakal, to which she probably belonged. This is a bit of decryption. The family, Bungaree's family. There's a word we haven't been able to find. The Russian called it Gaggleby, and they seem to have meant family because there's another portrait of just a man, his wife and a child, also called Gaggleby. But we can't find it as a Russian word, and we can't find it as an Aboriginal word. Most of the people in this family group can be identified by comparison with Mikhailov's individual portraits. So, right to left is Buranavan, the man on the right. There's probably Bowen, because when the blanket lists of Bowen give out at Broken Bay, Buranavan follows for 4 years exactly there, and he doesn't appear anywhere else. And also, the Russians have got a word very much like Buranavan, also written on the portrait of Bowen Bungaree, Benelong's eldest son. Next to him is Gulan Badubi. showing cicatrices, and this is probably Rose, the wife of Toby, who is the next man wearing the headband. The woman seated is not known, but then we have Gar Uenren, which actually means daughter, Gurringen, Miss Diana, or Diana Bungaree, daughter of one of Bungaree's wives and a European, wearing a necklace or I think it's a necklace, it could be a scarf given to her. So the French, of course, collected the rival stories about Bungaree, and they asked him, how come his daughter was so white, and he said, my wife eated too much white bread. The next unknown woman with the blanket might be Gooseberry. She's too young to be Matura, and this might be 1820, about the time that Cora Gooseberry Bungaree joined Bungaree. So the sketch of the two left-hand muscular men, I noticed years ago, is more finished than the others in the group, and I conclude they weren't there, they weren't present when the original sketch was made, but added by Mikhailov to balance out the grouping. But one person does say the man on the extreme left front could be Bungaree. I see no resemblance at all. And there is another man whose portrait we have not seen from Russia because they didn't send it to Australia, and he was called Barabara Wilhelmini, and that's Willem and Anne, the man who became William Mannon, also a great voyager before he died. He named himself after the William and Anne ship, took that ship as his totem, as did Salamander from the Salamander whaler. So, but we do know that the top left-hand man with his hair wrapped in paper bark, smoking a pipe, is a copy from Perron's Atlas of Australia, and that is a man called Kurubarigal, which could mean Amakuri from Biragagal or Borigal, Radley's head. But there's a lot of trouble with the French. As I said in my book about Marinawi, about the voyages, the titles that went on the engravings were not as that were recorded originally on the paintings, and we had to show that to show who was Mosquito, who wasn't, Bulldog, his companion, the two men who were sent as Aboriginal convicts to Norfolk Island. So I sent Katrina this JPG twice, and it's called Bungaree, and it didn't come through. We were censored by Google. So I had to send it again as just by Lejeune, because that's the artist, Jules Lejeune. So be careful what you write in your emails. So we've got to 1824. I think this is just a marvellous sketch. It's almost like a very modern one by somebody like Jean Cocteau, pen and ink. And the artist was attached to the La Coquille, the corvette commanded by Jules Dumont d'Urville. That's the man who gave us the statue of Venus when he was on the Greek island of Milos. So that's why it's the Venus de Milo. And we're forever in his debt because of that. Also, he was a great explorer. In February 1824, the French mariners also witnessed a bigger than usual Aboriginal revenge combat near Sydney, and they met Bungaree, Bidji and Gogi or Kogi, who were regarded as chiefs, and they were impressed also by a demonstration of the returning boomerang. And that's, I've missed 1804, where Bungaree is the first person seen in the Sydney district flying a returning boomerang. And also said he was esteemed for his perfect manners as early as 1804. So by 1824, Bungaree had obviously adopted his persona of a character in Sydney town, an actor in the streets. He's wearing his cocked hat, cast-off military jacket, and his gorget. And here it bears the spurious inscription, Roi des Natifs, King of the Blacks. I think, artists had free rein to do what they liked, but quite often the captions were put on by other people. The French pharmacist, René René Primavère-Lesson. He was a pharmacist on one of the exploring French ships. And in May, I suppose I better tell him. No, it's still referring to this, sorry. He examined Bungaree's head and he noticed the unhealed fracture of the arm that Bungaree suffered in a payback in 1819, around about Christmas time, when Alexander Berry took him into his house at Crow's Nest House, and tried to treat him for his broken arm. But Bungaree stayed in the kitchen for about 6 or 7 days and then he left. So this was never cured, and years later he tried out the French by saying, when he was looking for a sailor that they'd lost, and he said, you know, you owe me a bottle of rum because I've broken my arm while looking for this sailor of yours at Manly. And people noticed that it didn't stop Bungaree's dexterity at paddling a canoe at all. And the French doctor examined the arm and said, no, this is done 10 years ago. So he may or may not have got his bottle of rum at that time. So Lesson found, again, the skull shattered by numerous blows of a club which would have felled a strong animal. And this is commonly said of many Aboriginal people. Bennelong himself, his body was a kind of map of his life. And when Aboriginal men met, they would talk to each other and they'd start pointing out, I got this one down here in this fight, and here's where he got me in the side during the payback. That was a kind of badge of meeting somebody. Augustus Earle, a travelling artist, arrived in Sydney from Hobart in May 1825, and he made use of the flat stone lithographic press brought to New South Wales by the amateur astronomer Governor Sir Thomas Brisbane. And these full-length hand-coloured lithographs of King Bungaree were the first lithographs ever produced in Australia, because Governor Brisbane hadn't got round to doing what he intended to do, which was map the stars of the Southern Hemisphere, and he never did. So Earle immortalised Bungaree's stance and gesture as he greeted visitors, though in a rather drab brown suit. These are hand-coloured at different times, obviously, because the one on the left, he stands atop the rocks with Fort Macquarie in the background. And note the small sailing boat in the first work, and the addition of a shadowy warship in the harbour below in the second, and that's one of the English ships coming into port. The lithographs were on sale for 50 shillings, a large amount at the time. The likeness is admirable. Bungaree quite enjoys the sight of himself, said the Sydney Gazette. That's Earle's most famous study of Bungaree. It's an oil that's in the National Portrait Gallery. It's owned by the National Library of Australia in Canberra. So many artists, I've often said, were drawn to Bungaree's distinctive image that today he appears in a rich gallery of 18 portraits and other illustrations. This was an extraordinary number, as there were only 2 or 3 portraits of most governors, including Governor Macquarie, for example. The artists included Augustus Earle, Pavel Mikhailov, Jules Lejeune, Charles Rhodius, Philip Parker King, John Carmichael and William Henry Fernyhough, and others came after that who actually just copied from them, and Fernyhough was the first of that because he didn't arrive in Australia till after Bungaree's death in 1830. The most famous portrait is Earle's oil Bungaree, a native of New South Wales, painted in 1826. Bungaree wears his scarlet jacket with brass buttons and gold lace, extends his black cocked hat in greeting, and I think there's an air of genuine nobility in that expression and bearing of Bungaree. At Fort Macquarie now, the ships of the Royal Navy China Squadron have moored off Bennelong Point in the background, and at far left, rounding the corner where the Opera House now stands, is the French corvette Coquille, bringing Jules Dumont d'Urville and his scientists. So Bungaree traditionally greeted chiefs at Governor Macquarie's annual native conference at Parramatta. That was instituted by Macquarie as part of his great plan to tame, I suppose, the friendly natives, while at the same time he's out on the frontier sending his army against those who revolted. He started a native school, which later moved to Blacktown, first of all at Parramatta, but then annually from 1814, except for 1 year missing, was the Native Conference, or Native Feast as it was called in the papers at that time. So I think traditionally Bungaree introduced Macquarie and other governors to the chiefs after he greeted them. And I think he's probably the Aboriginal man in the cocked hat with the brown jacket, with the English nobility there. That native conference was Macquarie's masterstroke. Those who attended feasted on ample grog and beef, calculated to turn their minds away from thoughts of pillaging cornfields. Governor and Mrs. Elizabeth Macquarie greeted them in a friendly manner, and at night and afterwards the various tribes sang and danced together in corroboree. They also had marriage arrangements, paybacks, they swapped implements, weapons and so on at these events. So they got a benefit from these things initiated by the Europeans too. The Parramatta Native Feast was revived after 1815, that's the year it was cancelled because of drought, and it continued annually until Governor Burke finally abolished it in 1835. But Augustus Earl returned to London in 1830, so he was involved with the firm of Hullmantle. These were people who sought to produce a range of lithographs that were meant to appeal to the British public. And with these two prints, you can see they took an each-way bet. They're denigrating the image of Bungaree in the left hand by adding the basket containing grog bottles, with his wife, probably Cora Gurdry, wrapped in a blanket and smoking a pipe. And the background of townhouses has replaced that view of Sydney and Bennelong Point, Sydney Cove. But in the right-hand portrait with the same title, Bungaree cuts a rather over-glamorised figure, and that was for the other kind of the audience who wanted to still see the noble savage. That right-hand portrait only turned up in the South Australian Museum in the last couple of years. Something new every month or so you find out about Bungaree. The Sydney from the Parramatta Road, 1829, is just one of John Carmichael's engravings. That print shows Bungaree and his people. They're on the wasteland near the Parramatta Road. That's now the site of Central Railway. And you can see the former toll gate in the background at the right. And in the early days, this sandy hilltop above the brickfields, which is now Chippendale, had been constantly used for revenge battles many times. And also, I think you could say the brickfields was the first fringe dwelling of Aboriginal people, because the Botany Bay people had a road going to Chippendale, and that's Botany Road now. That was their paths. They cut paths about a metre wide, they burned them and maintained them. And that was their way up to Sydney via the brickfields. At one time, Bennelong was asked to face a battle there, but he was given guards by the governor and went out and told them that he wouldn't fight. And because this was Governor Hunter, my old shipmate, Governor Hunter would not let me be wounded. So they very reluctantly went away because they didn't want to lose that facility of having that dwelling area with their gunners at Brickfield. In 1829, the last year of his life, Bungaree actually was usually living in the government domain, where the Botanic Gardens and the domain are now. Here he seems to be telling his followers, bang another wallaby on the barbecue. Charles Rodius, born in Cologne in Germany, he lived in Paris and he worked as a draftsman and engraver. Convicted of the theft of a lady's reticule, that's a kind of handbag at the opera with her opera glasses and so on, in April 1829 in Paris, and transported to New South Wales for 7 years. He arrived in Sydney on the ship Sarah in December 1829, aged 27. And Rodius was interestingly assigned to the Department of works without salary. He actually taught drawing to some of the clerks and people like that. His office was in the old government house in Phillip Street. Now that's the Museum of Sydney site. A short walk to the government domain, where he probably made these pencil sketches of Bungaree not long after arriving. He also painted the Newcastle Aboriginal man nicknamed Dirty Dick, who was killed by Bob Barat, a Port Stephens man in the domain in 1829. Bungaree gave some evidence about that killing to Reverend Frolcall, and that was, nothing was done, of course. Bob Barat turned out later on to be a leading tracker in Port Stephens area and Port Macquarie. So this is just the lithograph that I don't think is as interesting as the pencil sketches that Rhodius made of Bungaree's profile and side view from that drawing. So we come to Philip Parker King. Bungaree, Aboriginal of New South Wales, 1819, who accompanied me on my first voyage to the northwest coast. It's an ambiguous caption. Did he paint it in 1819? It's generally taken that he did, because in 1817, Bungaree had accompanied Philip Parker King, who wasn't a bad artist. This watercolour is generally thought to be the first representation of Bungaree. And P.P. King described Bungaree as about 45 years of age, of a sharp, intelligent and unassuming disposition. But look at that, his face is lined, the hair's curly and greying, and Bungaree looks older than in Mikhailov's portrait, painted in the following year, 1820. At right is the very similar face, stance and expression of Bungaree in the lithograph by Charles Rhodius, titled King Bungaree, Chief of the Broken Bay Tribe, NS Wales, and wrongly captioned, died 1832. Bungaree died in 1830. Despite the fact that Bungaree had died then, the caption continues, drawn from life 1831, and on stone 1834 by Charles Rhodius. It's probably based on the pencil sketch of Bungaree that Rhodius drew in 1829 that we saw earlier. So I'm saying the Mikhailov portrait of 1820 is the first. I'd like to suggest that anyway. But P.P. King was inspired by the Rhodius lithograph to produce his own Bungaree portrait in 1834 or later. It follows that Mikhailov's portrait is the first. King, the first Australian-born admiral, died in 1856, so he had plenty of time after 1834 to do that portrait. Yeah, this was the cover of the portrait I used on the cover of my book, King Bungaree in 1992. I can still remember back that far. A few months after his death, I've discovered recently, an image of Bungaree appeared on the painted signboard outside the King Bungaree public house in Clarence Street, Sydney. And the Sydney Gazette said, a great number of black natives have congregated around the spot since his exhibition, who point with significant gestures at their old leader, but cannot be persuaded to mention his name. They were following the taboo on saying the names of the recently dead in Aboriginal society. It's likely that this hotel sign was based on the watercolour sketch, Bungaree, King of Port Jackson, Tribe, Sydney, attributed to the deaf and dumb artist, engraver, signwriter, coach painter, John Carmichael. I chose the likeness that gives Bungaree an almost oriental dignity for the cover of my book. It's now in a private collection in Melbourne. In fact, its whereabouts aren't known because there was a family divorce. The wife got the painting, the children can't find it when they go around to the house, and it hasn't arrived at any sales. He only wanted $7,000 for it, and Mitchell Library knocked it back in 1992. They said it was too expensive. So here we come to William Henry Fernie-Har. He was an assistant surveyor, he was an architect, arrived in Sydney in 1836, so he never met Bungaree. And his published lithographic portraits and silhouettes are based on the published works by Earl and Rodius. His vision was influenced by the then popular pseudoscience of phrenology, the idea of being able to read the character of people by their bumps on their heads. Caricature and mockery enter these images of Bungaree. The titles are even actually applied with a rubber stamp, and the hand colouring of the prints is sloppy. Fernie-Ho might have painted Bungaree's widow, Cora Gooseberry Bungaree, from life, as she'd lived till 1852. And one of the discoveries that I made years ago was Cara, daughter of Maroubra, was indeed Cora Gooseberry Bungaree. So there's a kind of Aboriginal royalty running through the family there. These rather sombre busts of Bungaree. On the left, one by Fernie-Ho, but after Rodius, obviously. On the right, Laurie Nelson's bust that he made in Mosman Town Hall, and I was privileged to speak at the launching of that in 1999. So it almost looks like a death mask, the left-hand bust by Fernie-Ho. The sculptor of the right hand was Laurie Nelson. He's a Murray, born in Roma, Queensland. And I asked him a little bit about the statue, and he told me he was a bit puzzled how Bungaree's hair looked at the back of his head. And he solved the problem by modelling it on photos of Elvis Presley's mullet hairstyle. That's funny, but these busts of Bungaree foreshadow some disturbing news. That's in the Sydney Morning Herald in 1857. Notices of donations to the Australian Museum in College Street, Sydney, were regularly inserted in the Sydney Morning Herald during the 19th century. The entry, "Skull of King Bungaree, an Aboriginal of New South Wales," appeared among items received during November 1857 on page 8 in the SMH for Wednesday the 9th of December 1857, even though it's rather smudged and badly printed. And we have an upside down letter at the top of it there. According to a spokesman for the Australian Museum, the museum has no record of receiving the skull and certainly does not have it in its collection. If Bungaree's skull was lodged in the museum in 1857, that would mean his body had been dug up from the grave in which he was buried 27 years earlier at Rose Bay and decapitated. Haven't said this in public before, something I've been sitting on for some time, but it will appear in the story of Bob Waterhouse, won't it? Yes. It's possible that the donated skull might have been that, not of Bungaree, but of Bowen, perhaps his eldest son, who succeeded his father and wore his actual gorget. Bowen died in Sydney, aged about 56 in 1853. His second son, Tobin or Joe Bungaree, satirically called Toby Prince of Broken Bay, when he was put in the stocks for drunkenness in Sydney in 1837. He seems to have died in Sydney in 1842, but there are a few Tobys. There was a Toby from Newcastle, there was another Toby from Broken Bay. But whoever's skull this is missing. And I've thought about it. One possibility, it might have been acquired in 1858 when the Austrian scientific expedition from the ship Novara exchanged artefacts and skeletal remains with the Australian Museum. In Sydney, they were here. Would you believe there was there was an Austrian Navy. They had ports in Trieste and Venice at that time. And they put their ship in Cockatoo Island to be repaired, and they went around Sydney Harbour on a convoy, the officers. So on December the 1st, 1858, that's a year later than that donation mentioned, Dr. Carl Scherzer from the Novara was taken from Cogra to the Georges River by Edward Smith Hill, a curator at the Australian Museum, seeking to unearth the remains of an Aboriginal man named Tower, or Tawiri, who we know better as Tom Ugly. His remains were too decomposed, so the scientists dug up the skull of a man named Mickey or Saranin, and that obviously is in Vienna now. Scherzer, who first visited the Australian Museum in November 1858, wished to expand his collection of craniological specimens to take back to Vienna. So it's possible that the skull of Bungaree is now in the Novara collection, in the history collection at the Academy of Science in Vienna, Austria. At that time, the Australian Navy maintained ports, as I've said, in Venice and Trieste. So I haven't been able to push that line of inquiry further. I'll be writing to Vienna and trying to find out. But the document and the list of 42 objects exchanged at the Australian Museum is missing from the Australian Museum. It seems to happen a bit. So that's the end of those many faces of Bungaree. I just want to say one thing. I've got a fair bit on Bungaree in my book Murray Noe, Aboriginal Odysseys, published last year, and I've got about 6 authors' copies, and if anyone would like them, they can have them for $25, and the RRP is $35 if you come and see me, but I haven't got much change. I've only got $25 change on me. That might cause the trouble. So anyone got any questions?
Bungaree's father, Keith, was he leader of the Broken Bay tribe?
No, he was in, well, he might have been, but he was killed in...
What do we know about him?
He was, after Bungaree in 1804, was in Newcastle hunting escaped convicts. His father was doing the same thing, and he was killed in revenge by convicts. We don't know his name. We don't know if he might have been a Newcastle man. That language of Broken Bay people is very similar to that language in the north. So that's all we know. Also, Captain Menzies was going to prosecute the 2 convicts who killed Bungaree's father, but they said in Sydney, well, no, you haven't got a case to make.
But we don't know where he actually came from.
Not at all. Not at all.
Going
Yeah.
the other way, Keith, with Bowen, with his descendants, with his family, if we had any...
Oh, I'm not an expert on that. I do have an interesting theory, because I should have brought with me the picture of Sydney by McHale. You see a man and his wife and a child, and if you compare that man with the figure of Salamander, it's obviously Salamander, and the figure of the woman is that of Goringan, who's photographed with, who's painted with Matura. And it's definitely that same woman. So here we are. Salamander obviously was a son-in-law of Bungaree. He always hung around with Bowen and Toby. He took people on fishing expeditions with them in the 1830s. So I would just sort of suggest that Salamander, well, Biddy Salamander, his wife, is the Biddy is the mother of Sarah, and there's a missing generation there. Would explain quite a few things, but I can't say I'm an expert in that area. There's some others here. Yeah.
One of the early pictures you had there of the family, you said one could be Willimarine.
Yeah.
Was he the one that speared?
No, not Willimarine. No, Willimanan. Willimanan speared Philip.
Yeah.
Colby and Benoit called in Willimarine to wound Philip, in my opinion. And I've said that in my book, and then later, Willimanan named himself after the ship, so he's quite a different person. Yeah. But Willimarine was from Broken Bay. Yeah.
I was wondering if you had a proven link that Sophie, Charlotte Ashby's mother, was the...
Again, I don't. Her name's Sophie Baranga, so it's not Bungaree, is it?
Okay, so there's not...
Warren-
There's a lot of talk about,
Warren Whitfield asked me many years ago,
but
about
there's no proof.
15 years ago, what relationship could she be to Bungaree? And I said, well, possibly his granddaughter or his niece.
Oh, okay.
So it seemed to get set in concrete after that.
Okay.
We don't know. She's just, she's on blanket list several times as a member of Bungaree's clan, the Walkala.
So she was from Pearl Beach?
She's from Broken Bay, I don't know about whether it's specifically Pearl Beach.
Okay, so, and with Bungaree's children,
Mm. They had a lot of children, Toby and Owen, but I haven't tried to trace
There's
them
no
too
way of
much.
proving his children? Is
Well,
that-
because they were all given those saints' names when they were baptised in St Mary's and other places. It's very difficult to try to trace them. They must be, descendants must exist. It's new things to find out still, always something new of Bungaree and Benelong.
What chance do you think there is of finding out more, Keith?
Oh, you just keep pushing it, just keep looking. Be a magpie in the manuscript. That's the only way now, because that doesn't seem to be the oral history, which would help to match it up. And we, the baptismal records have got these strange names. What happened to those people later? But we did find things like Gogi on the Georges River that had been found to have just sat down on a bit of wasteland, and generations of them live there. And we now have to send it. So, I'm sure lots of people who are claiming their descendants probably are, but you can't get that final link. Yeah.
Because I found the link to Sophie at the Gosford Library,
Yeah.
and it said that she was, didn't mention anything about Bungaree, but
No.
she was found receiving blankets.
Yeah. Well, I've got 4 instances of her receiving blankets. One time she's called Sarah.
Oh, okay.
Sophie the rest of the time. So it was probably the Reverend Feldell who recorded these blanket issuing too. It's a marvellous census of Aboriginal people, these annual distributions of blankets. I got a shock when I found one from 1850 recently, when you thought it would have been given up in Sydney and everybody's on it, like Marut and all the people who survived at that time. So that kind of thing could still turn up. We don't know. Thanks very much for coming and listening and looking.